Of all the types of fish used for sushi, bluefin tuna is the most expensive. In 2019, Kiyoshi Kimura bought one of these fish for $3 million.
Do any of you feel like sushi?
When that 278-kilogram tuna got made into sushi, how much did it cost? Well, it couldn't have been cheap. But then again, sushi is never cheap. But why does fresh sushi seem so spendy? Is good sushi worth the price? And what is the most expensive part of sushi? Is it the special ingredients? Highly trained sushi chefs? Or does the hype about sushi restaurants hike their prices? Put your guess in the comments below and stick around as we roll up the answers. There are different qualities of sushi. There's the pre-packaged stuff you grab from a store. And then there's the type of sushi you need a reservation to eat. And there's the middle-level sushi that's not cheap but somewhat affordable. So what's the difference between the more expensive and the cheaper stuff? Well, it's quality. And when I say quality, I mean quality in every step along the way. First, there's the fish. You can't eat every fish raw. It needs to be specially stored and prepared to be considered sushi grade. The best fish is raised, captured, cleaned, and delivered with perfection. But even expensive sushi-grade fish is usually frozen. High-end restaurants use fish dipped in liquid nitrogen, the quickest and best way to freeze fish. If you were lucky enough to dine at a renowned sushi restaurant, the master sushi chef, or Itamae, would craft your sushi from a whole fish. This way, you would get to enjoy all the subtle flavors of the meat. Let's compare that to the sushi you buy from a grocery store. This fish has been refrigerated for a long time and comes in pre-sliced fillets. That makes the fish taste, well, kinda bland. And if you're eating maki or nigiri, you're also eating rice. Now I know what you're thinking. Rice is just rice. That's where you're mistaken. Let's go back to that high-end sushi restaurant. Back in the kitchen, an apprentice is carefully preparing sushi rice with vinegar, sugar, and salt. The amount of each ingredient is important. The flavor of the rice needs to complement the fish. The rice might sound like a minor thing, but think of the last subpar sushi you ate. It probably had dry, tasteless rice that ruined the whole experience. So, rice matters. Expertly sourced and cooked ingredients definitely contribute to a higher cost for sushi. And every high-end sushi restaurant has an Itamae running the show. They're the ones who prepare the fish and layer, roll, and cut the sushi by hand. Itamaes also source the fish for their kitchens, and they often have special connections at fish markets to get the best fish. It takes about 10 years of training and experience to become an Itamae, and sometimes longer. If you really love sushi and want to become a master yourself, how would you do it? First, you go to a training school like the Tokyo Sushi Academy. After you make it through the program, you'd begin an apprenticeship. Starting at the bottom, you'd work as a cleaner. Once you've proven your dedication, you'd get to move on and prepare perfect sushi rice. The last step of your apprenticeship is becoming a wakiita. In Japanese, this means close to the chopping board. You would spend years as a wakiita until your boss decides that you are finally ready to become an Itamae. Because of their rigorous training and long experience, Itamaes have large salaries. So while the ingredients of your sushi matter, you're really paying for the high level of skill of an Itamae. And while hype can drive up the cost of sushi, it's not the main reason sushi costs so much. The world's best sushi restaurant, Tsukiyobashi Jiro, lost its Michelin stars after deciding only to cater to the elite. So, you'll probably never taste the 40,000 yen chef selection at Tsukiyobashi Jiro, But there are plenty of other top-notch options out there. And if eating the best sushi isn't enough for you, you could indulge in another Japanese delicacy, torafugu. But beware, as this fish contains toxins that can kill. How do you eat it safely? You can find that answer and more, guess where? On another episode of Origins of Food.